The campaign against Russia was not just a defeat, it was a cataclysm that reshaped Europe and history itself. For Napoleon, the invasion was the gamble of a lifetime, and it cost him everything. Welcome to Historical Moments, where we take you on a journey through time. Our channel is dedicated to bringing you fascinating stories, pivotal events, and unforgettable moments that have shaped our world. Whether it's a significant battle, a game-changing discovery, or a moment of triumph, we uncover the history that defines us. Subscribe and join us as we explore the past, one moment at a time. It's 1799. France is in chaos. The monarchy has fallen, the republic is crumbling, and enemies circle like vultures. Out of this turmoil, one man rises, a figure so brilliant and bold that his name will echo through history. Napoleon Bonaparte. Born in Corsica in 1769, Napoleon was no stranger to upheaval, but it was the French Revolution that set the stage for his meteoric rise. By 24, he was a general. By 26, a hero, thanks to stunning victories over Austria in Italy. Yet glory on the battlefield wasn't enough for him. Napoleon's ambition burned brighter than any rank could offer. In 1799, seizing the moment as France teetered on collapse, Napoleon orchestrated a coup d'état, the coup of 18 Brumaire. With the stroke of political genius and a dash of military muscle, he dissolved the Directory and established the consulate. He named himself First Consul, a title that gave him near dictatorial power. France wanted stability, and Napoleon promised it. In return, they gave him their trust, and with it, their future. Over the next several years, Napoleon transformed France. He reined in the chaos, negotiated peace with European rivals, and passed sweeping reforms. The Napoleonic Code was his crowning achievement, a legal framework so influential it still impacts laws today. Streets became safe again, schools reopened, and slowly France began to rebuild. But Napoleon wasn't content to rebuild, he wanted an empire. In 1804, in a stunning display of audacity, he crowned himself Emperor of the French. Not even the Pope was allowed to place the crown upon his head. This was Napoleon's moment, and he wanted the world to know it. By 1805, Napoleon had reshaped the destiny of France. His victory at Austerlitz, the Battle of the Three Emperors, confirmed his brilliance on the battlefield and cemented his role as Europe's most formidable leader. Little did the world know, the rise of Napoleon was only the beginning of a story that would change history forever. The sun rose over the plains near the small Italian village of Marengo on the morning of June 14, 1800, but its warm light did little to dispel the tension gripping the French and Austrian armies. For hours, soldiers shifted nervously in neat formations that stretched in every direction, awaiting commands from generals and marshals who knew the fate of a continent might hinge on the day's events. On the French side, General Napoleon Bonaparte sat astride his horse, his piercing gaze scanning the landscape. Only 30 years old, he was already a hero of the French Revolution and the first consul of the French Republic. Yet this battle, much like his entire Italian campaign, was a high-stakes gamble. His objective? To dislodge the Austrian Habsburg Empire from northern Italy and secure French dominance over the region. If he succeeded, his political power back in Paris would be unshakable. If he failed, it could all fall apart. The Austrian army, led by General Michael von Melas, had been well prepared. Their forces outnumbered the French, 30,000 soldiers to Napoleon's 28,000. though that disparity was made worse by how thinly stretched the French forces had become. Napoleon, always daring, had spread his forces across Italy to confuse the Austrians. But it was a strategy that left him dangerously vulnerable if Melas struck swiftly. And Melas intended to do just that. Napoleon believed he had Melas pinned in the northern town of Alessandria, but the aging Austrian general had different plans. While Napoleon expected reticence and hesitation, Melas moved his troops under the cover of darkness, surprising the French army at dawn. Columns of Austrian soldiers swept out of Alessandria and slammed into the French positions around Marengo in a coordinated assault. Within hours, it was chaos. Napoleon, caught off guard by the unexpected ferocity of the Austrian attack, scrambled to hold the line. His troops, a mix of seasoned veterans and fresh recruits, were driven back by the Austrian advance. Villages were overrun, artillery positions lost, and roads choked with retreating men. To the soldiers on the ground, it appeared as though the French army might collapse entirely. Chaos reigned across the battlefield, and fear gripped the hearts of the French soldiers as they faced the relentless Austrian assault. In the midst of this chaos, Bonaparte never betrayed his fear, though it surely crept beneath his composed exterior. His orders were deliberate, decisive, and often counterintuitive. Where others would have locked the army into defensive positions, Napoleon's instinct remained aggressive. He directed his generals, Lannes, Desaix, Victor, with clarity, rallying divisions to counter-assault the advancing Austrian lines wherever possible. But even Napoleon's genius could not conjure a victory from thin air. By early afternoon, it was clear the French were losing. Major French units were routed or retreating in disarray. At the village of Marengo itself, Austrian troops had gained control, forcing the French back several miles eastward. As reports streamed in, even Napoleon began to weigh the possibility that the battle might be lost. In this desperate moment, however, a figure arrived on the battlefield who would change the course of history: General Louis Desaix. General Desaix's arrival infused fresh energy into the beleaguered French forces. Having delayed earlier by miscommunication, Desaix and his division had finally arrived to reinforce the French. Napoleon, seeing a spark of hope, immediately turned to Desaix.
"We have lost the battle. It is only 2 o'clock. There is time to win another."
Desaix's arrival infused fresh energy into the beleaguered French forces. Napoleon quickly revised his strategy, concentrating his remaining troops around Desaix's corps. Artillery was repositioned, cavalry regrouped, and a counteroffensive was devised. Desaix took personal command of the advancing infantry, leading his men directly into the thick of the Austrian center. As Desaix's soldiers clashed with the Austrians, a deafening roar of muskets and cannon fire filled the battlefield. The ground shook with the thunder of hooves as French cavalry led by the legendary Joachim Murat swept into the flanks of the Austrian army. The Austrians, caught between Desaix's aggressive push and the cavalry hammering them from the side, began to falter. But tragedy struck during this pivotal moment. Desaix, hero of the hour, was hit by an Austrian musket ball and killed instantly while leading his charge. The French soldiers saw him fall, and for a brief, precarious moment, it seemed as if the loss might shatter their morale. But Desaix's sacrifice was not in vain. By now, panic was spreading among the Austrian ranks, and Napoleon seized the opportunity to press the attack further. In the final hours of the battle, fate shifted decisively into Napoleon's favor. A devastating bombardment from French artillery obliterated the Austrian center, causing widespread confusion. Exhausted and disorganized, the Austrians began to retreat, with shouts of surrender echoing through the evening air. Those once confident ranks of Austrian infantry dissolved into rout, and by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the tide had well and truly turned. Napoleon had won. As the battlefield fell silent, Napoleon surveyed the scene. Smoke rose across the plains, the air thick with the acrid smell of spent gunpowder. Marengo was a hard-fought and bloody victory. Some 7,000 French and over 9,000 Austrians lay dead or wounded. Napoleon himself later admitted that the battle had hung on a knife edge, one of the most precarious moments of his career. Yet he emerged victorious, and the consequences would prove transformational. The defeat forced Malas and the Austrian Empire to the negotiating table, leading to the Treaty of Lunéville in early 1801. Northern Italy fell firmly under French control, cementing Napoleon's reputation not only as a brilliant general, but as a shaper of Europe's political future. The victory at Marengo also reinforced Napoleon's image as a leader of resilience and audacity, willing to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. It was a critical stepping stone on his path to crowning himself Emperor of France just 4 years later. Yet Marengo wasn't merely a tale of Napoleon's strategic prowess. It was also a reminder of the thin line between triumph and disaster in warfare, and the role played by bravery, timing, and sometimes sheer chance. For Napoleon, the Battle of Marengo proved an invaluable lesson in survival and adaptation, one he would carry with him through the heights and depths of his storied reign. Today, the name Marengo is immortalized not just in history books, but even in popular culture. The battle became so synonymous with Napoleon that he allegedly named his favorite horse Marengo after it. Even chicken à la Marengo, a dish said to have been improvised from whatever provisions were available after the battle, survives as an odd culinary tribute. But beyond the anecdotes and the legends, Marengo stands as a testament to the extraordinary character of one man who refused to accept defeat, and in doing so, altered the course of history. Napoleon's star, already rising, blazed even brighter after that fateful June day in Italy, and its light would illuminate and shadow the destiny of Europe for years to come. The year is 1805, and Europe stands on the precipice of monumental change. Napoleon Bonaparte, self-proclaimed Emperor of the French, is at the zenith of his power. Yet his ambitions for continental dominance have not gone unnoticed. Across the monarchies of Europe, fear and mistrust have united old rivals in what will come to be called the War of the Third Coalition. Austria, Russia, Britain, and Sweden, a staggering alliance of empires determined to halt Napoleon's expansion, are prepared to crush his ambitions under the weight of their armies. But Napoleon is no stranger to being outnumbered. He thrives under the pressure of adversity, using daring strategy and sheer brilliance to transform seemingly impossible odds into stunning victories. At the heart of the conflict lies Napoleon's grand strategy, maintaining control over France's revolutionary ideals while striving to expand his empire. Yet as British ships dominate the seas after their naval triumph at Trafalgar, Napoleon must prove his superiority on land. He turns his attention to Austria and Russia, the two continental powers poised to invade French territory. In early autumn of 1805, Austria makes its first move. Archduke Charles leads an army to occupy the Tyrol. General Karl Max seizes Ulm in Bavaria, the gateway to the French-controlled Rhine territories. Max's forces are large and formidable, but there's a fatal flaw. Their positioning leaves them dangerously exposed to Napoleon's counterstroke. Napoleon, relying on the precision of his army, plans to strike with unparalleled speed. His soldiers, veterans of campaigns in Italy and Egypt, are hardened by years of war. Their emperor demands total commitment, instilling discipline and loyalty, even as relentless marching tests their stamina to the limit. Napoleon knows every step counts. Speed is the fulcrum of his strategy. By November, Napoleon's Grande Armée sets one of the most remarkable military maneuvers in history into motion. A massive concentration of troops towards southern Germany, executed so swiftly it takes Mack and his allies completely by surprise. Instead of the traditional frontal attack strategy European armies are accustomed to, Napoleon envelops the Austrian position at Ulm like a noose tightening around its prey. Imagine, night after night, French troops maneuver along Bavarian roads under cover of darkness, their movements veiled by secrecy. They cross rivers and mountain passes with fluid coordination. The silence of each maneuver is broken only by whispered orders and the grinding of wheels pulling artillery. The walls close in on Mack's forces before he even realizes the trap has been sprung. By mid-October, Napoleon achieves his first great triumph of the campaign. Mack and his 25,000 Austrian soldiers are encircled and forced to surrender at the Battle of Ulm, without Napoleon ever firing a shot in the final moments. It's a masterstroke, demonstrating his philosophy that winning wars isn't merely about brute force, but about intelligence, deception, and timing. But Napoleon can't stop now. Mack's surrender is only the overture. Austria may be shaken, but Russia's mighty army is marching westward, eager to finish what Mack could not. Napoleon suspects that Tsar Alexander's forces will link up with any remaining Austrian units, bolstering their strength and potentially outnumbering the Grande Armée. Napoleon needs a climactic battle, and he knows exactly where to lead them. As winter grips Europe, Napoleon lures the coalition forces to the plains outside the town of Austerlitz in modern-day Czechia. He's chosen this battlefield with meticulous care. The coalition commanders, Alexander of Russia and Francis II of Austria, believe their combined armies have Napoleon cornered. They're confident in their numerical advantage, fielding nearly 90,000 men against Napoleon's 68,000. But this confidence is precisely what Napoleon counts on, coaxing them into positions that will prove disastrous. On December 2nd, 1805, the Battle of Austerlitz begins, the date chosen deliberately by Napoleon to coincide with the one-year anniversary of his coronation as emperor. The battle is later nicknamed the Battle of the Three Emperors, for the monarchs who either led or watched their armies fight that day. Napoleon crafts a subtle trap, presenting a false weakness. He deliberately weakens his right flank, inviting the coalition forces to attack. His foes take the bait, shifting their troops in pursuit of what appears to be an easy breakthrough. But then the trap is sprung. Napoleon's troops execute a stunning counterattack. Led by General Desaix, the French forces surge forward, reclaiming the heights of Pratzen that Alexander and Francis thought secure. The elevated land serves as the linchpin for Napoleon's strategy, splitting the coalition forces and sowing chaos in their lines. French artillery pounds the advancing forces, while cavalry units slice through their formations with ruthless precision. The battlefield becomes an inferno of smoke, musket fire, and clashing steel. Napoleon himself remains calm in the chaos, riding his white horse across the battlefield to issue commands. Each tailored maneuver drives his enemies further into disarray. At one point, he famously exclaims, "One sharp blow, and the war is ended." His leadership is both unyielding and inspiring, the Grande Armée fighting with the confidence of soldiers who trust their leader implicitly. As the day unfolds, the coalition army crumbles. French soldiers exploit weaknesses with machine-like efficiency, chasing retreating units into partially frozen lakes, where many coalition troops drown in icy waters. By nightfall, it's evident Napoleon has won not just a battle, but total domination. The victory at Austerlitz stuns Europe. In less than 3 months, Napoleon has shattered the Third Coalition. Napoleon's influence spreads across Europe, reshaping the continent's political landscape. The Treaty of Pressburg, signed shortly after the battle, forces Austria out of the war and cedes vast territories to France, cementing Napoleon's influence over Central Europe. Tsar Alexander retreats to Russia, his dreams of defeating Napoleon dashed. Napoleon's brilliance at Austerlitz elevates his reputation to legendary status. Military schools study his strategy for centuries, marveling at how he turned desperation into opportunity. But his victory also sets the stage for new conflicts. Europe's monarchs won't give up their fight against Napoleon so easily. The battles that follow, against Prussia, Spain, and eventually Russia, will test him in ways even Austerlitz could not. For now, though, Napoleon stands triumphant, the sun of Austerlitz shining brightly over his empire. The campaign of 1805 remains one of the most extraordinary examples of military strategy in history, a testament to the fact that sometimes the brilliance of one man truly can reshape the destiny of an entire continent. It was the dawn of December 2nd, 1805. The air was sharp and cold as the first beams of sunlight illuminated frost-covered fields outside the town of Austerlitz in modern-day Czechia. The battlefield was quiet, but within hours it would erupt into chaos, a clash of empires that would decide the fate of Europe for generations. Napoleon Bonaparte, the self-proclaimed Emperor of the French, stood at the peak of his power. His military genius had carried France to victory time and again, transforming a nation born of revolution into the most formidable force on the continent. But now he faced his greatest challenge yet: the combined might of the Third Coalition, an alliance of Austria, Russia, and Great Britain, determined to crush him. The stakes could not have been higher. If Napoleon fell at Austerlitz, France's dominance in Europe would collapse, and the fragile gains of the revolution would unravel. But Napoleon was not a man to be defeated easily. He had spent days meticulously preparing for this moment, and now, as he looked out over the frozen plains dotted with enemy encampments, he was ready to spring his trap. The Third Coalition was confident. With nearly 90,000 soldiers under the command of Austria's General von Weyrother and Russia's Tsar Alexander I, they vastly outnumbered Napoleon's army of 68,000. They believed their strength would break him, and their strategy was simple: smash through Napoleon's right flank, cutting him off from his escape route. What they didn't know was that Napoleon had anticipated their every move. In the days leading up to the battle, Napoleon had executed a brilliant deception. He feigned weakness, pulling back his troops and leaving his right flank, his army's southern position, appearing vulnerable. To the coalition commanders, it looked like Napoleon was in full retreat. In reality, this was an elaborate ruse designed to lure them into a trap. As dawn broke on December 2nd, the coalition forces launched their attack. Their massive vanguard thundered forward, sweeping toward the seemingly vulnerable right flank. Austrian and Russian troops surged across fog-covered fields, confident that victory was within their grasp. But as the coalition's forces moved deeper into Napoleon's trap, they unknowingly exposed themselves to a devastating counterstrike. For hours, the central and northern parts of the battlefield remained largely quiet. Rather than countering the coalition's advance head-on, Napoleon allowed their forces to press forward, drawing them further into the southern plain. And then, at precisely the right moment, he struck. At 8 a.m., with the sun rising above the battlefield, later referred to as the sun of Austerlitz, Napoleon gave the order. From small hilltops overlooking the coalition center came an eruption of motion and chaos. French troops surged forward. Napoleon knew that the coalition's attack had left their center dangerously exposed, and now he aimed to split their entire force in two. Marshal Soult, one of Napoleon's most trusted commanders, led French infantry in a bold assault uphill toward the Pratzen Heights, the high ground that served as the coalition's central position. This was the critical moment of the battle. If Napoleon could take the Pratzen Heights, he would divide the enemy army and throw them into disarray. Soul's troops charged fiercely, bayonets gleaming in the morning light, and clashed with Austrian and Russian defenders. The fighting was brutal, with the ground littered with fallen soldiers, but the French momentum was unstoppable. Within hours, the Pratzen Heights were in Napoleon's hands, and the coalition forces found themselves cut off from one another. As panic rippled through the enemy ranks, Napoleon unleashed the next phase of his plan. His elite cavalry, led by Generals Murat and Lannes, surged forward to exploit the gaps in the enemy lines. Coalition troops tried desperately to regroup, but it was too late. They found themselves caught between waves of French attackers, falling into chaos. Meanwhile, Napoleon's southern forces, those who had pretended to retreat, launched a decisive counterattack against the advancing Austrians and Russians. The coalition's right flank buckled under the pressure, and soldiers in its ranks began fleeing the battlefield, their confidence shattered. But Napoleon wasn't finished. He moved quickly to encircle the enemy near the frozen Sachin Ponds, a series of shallow lakes on the battlefield. French artillery rained down on coalition soldiers, forcing many into the icy waters. Chaos engulfed the ponds as soldiers attempted to cross, only to break through thin ice and plummet into freezing water below. Hundreds drowned in the bitter cold, their bodies piling beneath the surface, a haunting reminder of the cost of war. By late afternoon, it was clear. The coalition had been decisively defeated. Napoleon's corps had taken the battlefield with precision, ferocity, and unrivaled tactical brilliance. The once mighty forces of Austria and Russia were scattered, leaving tens of thousands of dead, wounded, or captured soldiers in their wake. As darkness fell over the plains of Austerlitz, Napoleon surveyed the battlefield, his victory assured. Austria was forced to sign the Treaty of Pressburg, ceding vast territories to France and withdrawing from the coalition. And Napoleon's position as Emperor of the French grew ever stronger, his reputation soaring to mythical levels. But Austerlitz was more than just a military triumph. It was a masterclass in strategy, deception, and timing. Napoleon had taken on an army larger than his own, anticipated its every move, and turned its greatest strength, a numerical advantage, into its fatal weakness. Years later, Napoleon would call Austerlitz the finest victory of his career, and historians would agree. Yet, as we look back on that fateful day, we must remember the lives lost, the soldiers who fought and died for empires and ambitions greater than themselves. For all its brilliance, Austerlitz was a stark reminder of the brutality of war. It was a victory carved not just from strategy, but from sacrifice. Today, the fields of Austerlitz are quiet again. But if you were to walk them at dawn, you might imagine the sound of marching footsteps, the clash of steel on steel, and the cries of men giving their all for the leaders they served. And you might look east to where the sun still rises over the landscape, a silent echo of the sun of Austerlitz, and the day Napoleon changed history forever. Between the years of 1806 and 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte stood as the undisputed master of Europe, a leader whose ambitions shaped the map and destiny of a continent. This was the peak of his reign, the height of power in every sense, when he seemed almost invincible. But what made these years so extraordinary? And how did Napoleon forge an empire that others could only dream of? By 1806, Napoleon had already crowned himself Emperor of the French, but his ambitions stretched far beyond France's borders. His victories at Austerlitz and Jena Auerstedt shattered the forces of Austria and Prussia, reshaping the European political landscape. Napoleon established the Confederation of the Rhine, effectively dismantling the Holy Roman Empire, a power that had stood for nearly 1,000 years. Across Europe, Monarchs trembled as Napoleon redrew boundaries and placed his puppet rulers on their thrones. The Napoleonic Code united lands under a single legal framework, spreading Enlightenment ideals alongside imperial domination. Roads, cities, and schools flourished under his reforms. Napoleon wasn't just a conqueror. He wanted to be remembered as a builder, a lawgiver, a modernizer. But there was no escaping his endless wars. The continental system, his plan to economically isolate Britain, embroiled him in conflicts across the continent. Spain, in particular, became a thorn in his side, as guerrilla warfare and rebellion bogged down his forces, draining resources and morale. Then came 1812, when Napoleon embarked on his greatest gamble, the invasion of Russia. This would define not just his supremacy, but also his limits, as he led the Grande Armée, over 600,000 strong, into the vast plains of Eastern Europe. His empire seemed unstoppable. But the same man who had shattered so many armies would soon face his own undoing. Between triumph and disaster, Napoleon's legacy was cemented. For 6 years, he ruled as the hegemon of Europe, a genius, a kingmaker, and above all, a man who changed history. October 14th, 1806. The winds of war sweep across Europe, and in the rolling fields and forests of Saxony, two armies are poised for battle. On one side, Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of the French and one of history's most brilliant military minds. On the other, the armies of the Prussian monarchy, proud and defiant, yet still clinging to outdated methods of warfare. What unfolds at Jena and Austerlitz will determine not only the fate of Prussia, but also Napoleon's dominance over Central Europe in the Napoleonic Wars. The story begins months earlier. Napoleon had cemented his reputation with decisive victories across the continent, Marengo, Austerlitz, and others that transformed Europe's political landscape. But tensions remained high. Prussia, once the preeminent military power of Europe, now felt overshadowed by the meteoric rise of Napoleon's Grande Armée. Motivated by fear of France's growing influence and a desire to reclaim their pride, King Frederick William III of Prussia made the fateful decision to go to war. The Prussian commanders, however, were plagued by indecision and disorganization. Their forces were vast, with nearly 120,000 soldiers spread across the region, but their strategy was outdated, relying on slow, rigid formations, relics of 18th century warfare. Meanwhile, Napoleon's Grande Armée was different. It was fast, flexible, and organized into corps that could act independently, yet coordinate seamlessly on the battlefield. Napoleon, the master of maneuver, realized he could exploit this advantage to devastating effect. As the French army advanced eastward, seeking to engage the Prussians, Napoleon's plans came together like clockwork. His goal, to divide the Prussian forces and crush them in detail. He spread his corps across multiple routes, enveloping and pressuring the enemy from multiple directions. At dawn on October 14th, the fog was thick, cloaking the sprawling countryside. Napoleon positioned himself at Jena, where he believed the bulk of the Prussian army lay. Across the valley, nearly 40,000 Prussian troops under General Hohenlohe awaited his attack. They didn't yet know that Napoleon had over 90,000 men ready to unleash hell. Napoleon wasted no time. He ordered his artillery to bombard the Prussians with relentless precision, shaking their formations before sending waves of infantry forward. It was classic Napoleonic warfare: calculate, strike, overwhelm. The Prussians struggled to adapt, their rigid lines faltering under the weight of the French assault. Napoleon, standing amidst his men, inspired confidence, his presence commanding respect and fear alike. He saw opportunities where others saw chaos, exploiting gaps in the Prussian defense with surgical precision. But the Battle of Jena was just one half of the story. 20 kilometers north, at Auerstedt, an even more astonishing drama was unfolding. Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout, commanding a single French corps of 26,000 men, faced the main Prussian army, over 60,000 troops under Duke Charles William Ferdinand. Outnumbered 2-1, many would have considered retreat the only option. Not Davout. He was a man of steady resolve and sharp tactical acumen. He knew that victory here could ensure total dominance for Napoleon's campaign. The Prussians advanced, confident in their numerical advantage, but Davout's men stood firm. Using the terrain to his advantage, the Marshal orchestrated a defense that repulsed wave after wave of Prussian attacks. His artillery shattered enemy charges. His disciplined infantry held their lines under intense pressure. As the day wore on, the Prussians grew desperate, their formations breaking as Davout's corps counterattacked. By afternoon, the impossible had become reality. Davout had achieved victory against overwhelming odds, inflicting devastating losses on the Prussian army. Back at Jena, Napoleon's triumph was equally decisive. By mid-afternoon, Hohenlohe's forces were in complete disarray, retreating under relentless French pressure. Napoleon, always calculating, sent his cavalry to pursue the fleeing Prussians, turning their retreat into a chaotic rout. Thousands were captured, and what remained of the Prussian forces was scattered across the countryside. Jena and Auerstedt had been dual catastrophes for Prussia, and the shockwaves of defeat were immediate. King Frederick William III fled, his court thrown into turmoil. The once mighty Prussian army, renowned for its discipline and order, was utterly shattered. In a matter of weeks, Napoleon marched through the heart of Prussia, capturing Berlin and imposing harsh peace terms. The Prussian kingdom was humbled, forced to reorganize its army and government under French oversight. For Napoleon, the battles solidified his control over continental Europe, proving once again his unmatched skill as a military strategist. The consequences of Jena-Auerstedt stretched beyond the battlefield. Prussia's defeat marked a critical turning point in the Napoleonic Wars, shaking the balance of power in Europe. The battle exposed the weaknesses of outdated military practices and underscored the need for reforms that would define modern warfare. For Napoleon, it was proof that his Grande Armée was a force unlike any other, a model of innovation and discipline capable of reshaping the continent. But the victory also sowed the seeds of future resistance. Across Europe, Napoleon's dominance inspired both admiration and dread. Nations began to learn from his methods, adapting their strategies to counter the seemingly unstoppable French emperor. Prussia, humiliated but determined, embarked on sweeping reforms that would eventually restore its status as a formidable power, though that resurgence would come only after years of rebuilding and effort. Jena and Auerstedt remain etched in history as one of Napoleon's most stunning achievements, a display of tactical brilliance and ruthless efficiency. The fields where the battles raged are quiet now, but the lessons of those October days in 1806 still resonate. It was more than just a victory. It was a moment that reshaped the destiny of nations and defined an era dominated by war, ambition, and the relentless will of Napoleon Bonaparte. The year is 1807, and Europe is ablaze with the flames of war. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had risen from obscurity to become Emperor of the French, stands at the height of his power. Armies march across the continent, alliances are forged and broken, and nations grapple with the unstoppable force of Napoleon's ambition. The morning of June 14th dawned humid and overcast in the East Prussian town of Friedland, nestled along the banks of the Alle River. Napoleon's army of 80,000 men, Veterans hardened by years of near-constant campaigning faced off against an opposing force of roughly 60,000 Russians under the command of General Levin August von Bennigsen. Bennigsen, who had been attempting to regroup his scattered forces, made a dangerous misstep. He allowed his army to become trapped against the river, creating a bottleneck that Napoleon was quick to exploit. Napoleon himself strode into the battlefield, his hat tilted at a distinctive angle and his trademark gray coat draped over his shoulders. Despite the heat, he appeared calm and collected, his piercing gaze taking in every detail of his enemy's formation. To the soldiers around him, he was more than a general. He was a symbol of France's resurgence, a man whose genius had already reshaped the political landscape of Europe. From the start, Napoleon understood the stakes of Friedland. This wasn't just about beating the Russians. It was about ensuring French dominance in Europe. A decisive victory here could force Tsar Alexander I to consider peace, shattering the fourth coalition that had formed against France. But Napoleon's plans required patience. For now, he would use tactical feints and minor engagements to bait the Russians into committing more troops to a vulnerable position. As sunlight broke through the morning haze, the French soldiers launched probing attacks, using skirmishers to harass the Russian lines. The crack of musket fire echoed through the fields, mingling with the shouts of officers and the rumble of distant cannon. Bennigsen, unaware of the trap that was closing around him, ordered his forces to advance, pushing them further toward the narrow strip of land between the Allier River and the woods. By midday, the battlefield was chaotic, with soldiers fighting in dense clusters amidst fields and villages. Russian infantry surged forward, their bayonets glinting in the sunlight, driving into French positions. Napoleon allowed these maneuvers, all while carefully moving his reserves into position for the strike that would decide the battle. He was like a master chess player, maneuvering his opponent into a corner where defeat was inevitable. The turning point came in the late afternoon. Napoleon's reinforcements, commanded by Marshal Jean Lannes, reached the battlefield, swelling the French ranks with fresh troops. Lannes and his men struck hard, pushing back the Russian advance. Napoleon's artillery, arranged in a lethal crescent along the high ground, began thundering volleys into the center of the Russian lines. These cannons tore through infantry and cavalry alike, the sharp explosions reverberating across the battlefield. Recognizing that the Russian forces were overstretched and disorganized, Napoleon seized the moment to execute his decisive blow. He ordered a massive infantry attack supported by cavalry and artillery. The French soldiers surged forward in disciplined waves, bayonets fixed, flags fluttering in the smoke-filled air. With their drums beating the rhythm of the advance, they marched as one invincible tide toward the disoriented Russians. The battle's most dramatic moment came as Napoleon unleashed his elite Imperial Guard to turn the tide for good. This was the final stroke, the hammer blow that shattered the Russians' morale. Russian soldiers, exhausted and unable to maneuver effectively, began to break. Some fled toward the river, only to find themselves trapped as French cavalry rode them down. The Aal River, once a natural barrier, had become a death trap. By evening, the battlefield was a hellscape of smoke, fire, and blood. The Russian army was in complete disarray, suffering devastating losses. Casualties numbered over 20,000 on the Russian side, compared to approximately 10,000 for the French. Bennigsen's forces retreated in chaos, leaving Friedland firmly under Napoleon's control. As the sun sank below the horizon, Napoleon surveyed the battlefield from atop his horse. The devastation was immense, but strategically, the victory was flawless. Napoleon's gamble had paid off, and Europe would never be the same. Within days, Tsar Alexander I would agree to an armistice, paving the way for the Treaty of Tilsit, a settlement that would redraw the map of Europe and cement Napoleon's reputation as one of the greatest military strategists in history. But Friedland was more than a battle. It was a testament to Napoleon's ability to adapt, to maneuver, and to exploit his enemy's weaknesses. It showed the brilliance of his centralized command and the unmatched discipline of his troops. It also demonstrated the darker side of Napoleonic warfare, the relentless pursuit of victory at a staggering human cost. The Battle of Friedland marked the high water mark of Napoleon's empire. In the years that followed, his fortunes would decline as new coalitions rose against him, culminating in his ultimate defeat at Waterloo in 1815. But on that June day in 1807, Napoleon stood invincible, his vision for a unified Europe under French domination seemingly within reach. And as the echoes of Friedland faded, its lessons endured. Military historians and strategists would study the battle for generations, marveling at how Napoleon turned a precarious situation into a masterpiece of strategy. Friedland was, in many ways, the embodiment of Napoleon's genius, a moment where the art of war was transformed into a brutal symphony orchestrated by one of history's most enigmatic leaders. The year is 1808. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, is at the height of his power. His armies have marched across Europe, toppling monarchies and redrawing borders in the name of revolutionary ideals and imperial ambition. By this point, he has cowed Austria, crushed Prussia, and forced Russia into an uneasy alliance. Yet, in his quest to dominate the continent, one persistent thorn remains: Britain. Protected by its mighty navy and island geography, Britain seems impregnable. Napoleon knows the only way to bring his nemesis to its knees is economic strangulation, using what he calls the continental system, a Europe-wide embargo designed to starve British trade. But there's a problem: Portugal. A small but strategically critical nation on Europe's western edge, Portugal depends on trade with Britain for its survival and refuses to comply with Napoleon's embargo. For Napoleon, this defiance is unacceptable, and so, in 1807, he decides to act, ordering French troops to march through Spain to occupy Portugal. This decision would set in motion a chain of events that would engulf the Iberian Peninsula in a brutal and protracted conflict, and ultimately become one of Napoleon's greatest mistakes. The Peninsular War, as it would come to be known, began not with a bang, but with a betrayal. Napoleon had always considered Spain an ally, or at least a vassal, under its weak and divided Bourbon monarchy. Yet, when French troops occupied key cities in Spain under the pretense of marching to Portugal, it became clear that Napoleon had no intention of leaving. In March of 1808, under a veil of deception, Napoleon forced Spain's King Charles IV to abdicate. He then placed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne, an act that enraged the Spanish people. To the proud citizens of Spain, their nation's dignity and independence had been stolen by a foreign tyrant. The Spanish resistance erupted almost immediately. On May 2nd, 1808, known as the Dos de Mayo Uprising, the people of Madrid rose against the occupying French soldiers. Ordinary citizens, armed with little more than knives, rocks, and their sheer will, fought the disciplined forces of Napoleon's army. Though the rebellion was brutally crushed the next day, news of the uprising spread like wildfire. Across Spain, guerrilla bands formed, attacking French supply lines, ambushing patrols, and harassing isolated garrisons. Unlike the large, traditional armies Napoleon was accustomed to defeating on open battlefields, these irregular fighters were elusive and ruthless, turning every road and village into a potential death trap for French soldiers. Napoleon famously dismissed the Spanish guerrillas as mere bandits, but their impact was devastating. Every mile his troops marched deeper into Spain and Portugal, they bled manpower and morale. Meanwhile, Spain's regular army, though poorly trained and often outmatched by Napoleon's veteran forces, refused to capitulate. At the Battle of Bailen in July 1808, a Spanish army of 22,000 men achieved a shocking victory, forcing a French corps of nearly the same size to surrender. It was the first major defeat of Napoleon's forces in open combat and a powerful signal to Europe that the seemingly invincible French army could be beaten. In response, Napoleon decided to take matters into his own hands. In late 1808, he crossed the Pyrenees with reinforcements and directed a swift and relentless campaign to recapture lost ground. Predictably, the results were spectacular. By early 1809, Madrid was firmly under French control, and Napoleon's military genius seemed to have extinguished the flames of rebellion. But it was a temporary reprieve, and Napoleon, unaware of the storm brewing on the horizon, left Spain to focus on other fronts in Europe, leaving the Peninsular War in the hands of his marshals. While Napoleon's departure marked an uncertain turning point, his marshals were left to contend with the ongoing struggles of the Peninsular War. If the guerrillas were a nightmare for the French, the British army under Sir Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, would prove an even greater challenge. Landing in Portugal in 1808, Wellesley brought discipline, determination, and an eye for defensive warfare to the Iberian theater. While French generals pursued glory through bold offensives, Wellesley entrenched his forces behind the formidable lines of Torres Vedras, a network of defensive fortifications that turned Lisbon into an impenetrable fortress. Time and again, the French were forced to retreat, unable to breach Wellesley's defenses or cut his supply lines. What made the Peninsular War unique wasn't just the battles, but the sheer complexity of the conflict. Spain and Portugal became a quagmire for Napoleon's forces, who were spread thin across thousands of miles of rugged terrain. In the cities, French garrisons lived under the constant threat of insurrection. In the countryside, guerrilla fighters cut communication lines and preyed on isolated units. And on the battlefield, Wellington, often outnumbered, used his mastery of terrain to outwit the French. In battles like Talavera, Torres Vedras, and Salamanca, the British-Portuguese army dealt blow after blow to Napoleon's marshals. The human cost of the war was staggering. Villages were burned, civilians massacred, and entire regions depopulated as the conflict dragged on. For the Spanish and Portuguese, this was no mere war of conquest. It was a brutal struggle for independence, fueled by patriotism, religion, and sheer hatred for the occupiers. The French soldiers, meanwhile, found themselves despised and isolated in a hostile land, never knowing when an ambush might come or whether their next meal would arrive. By 1812, the Peninsular War became a major drain on Napoleon's resources. Desperate to maintain his grip on the region, he poured troops and supplies into the Iberian Peninsula, troops that were sorely needed elsewhere, especially as tensions with Russia escalated. That same year, Wellington launched a bold counteroffensive, seizing the fortified city of Badajoz in a bloody assault and defeating the French decisively at the Battle of Salamanca. By the end of the year, Joseph Bonaparte's puppet regime in Madrid was crumbling, and the tide of the war had turned irreversibly. The final phase of the war brought utter humiliation for Napoleon. In 1813, after the catastrophic failure of his invasion of Russia, the French Empire found itself overstretched and vulnerable. Wellington's Anglo-Portuguese army took full advantage, advancing steadily into Spain and eventually forcing the French to retreat across the Pyrenees. At the climactic Battle of Vittoria in June 1813, Wellington's forces shattered the French army, effectively ending Napoleon's hold on Spain. By 1814, as Napoleon fought for his very survival in Central Europe, his once mighty empire was collapsing on all fronts. The Peninsular War was more than just a military defeat for Napoleon. It was a deep psychological and strategic blow that exposed the limits of his power. The Iberian Peninsula, far from being a stepping stone to greater dominance, became a bleeding wound that sapped Napoleon's strength and morale. The war showed the world that Napoleon could be beaten, not just by grand coalitions of great powers, but by ordinary people fighting for their homeland. It provided a template for resistance that resonated far beyond Spain and Portugal, inspiring movements for national liberation throughout the 19th century. When Napoleon abdicated for the first time in 1814, the Peninsular War was one of the nails in the coffin of his ambitions. The Spanish and Portuguese people paid a terrible price in blood and suffering, but their struggle played a decisive role in reshaping Europe. Out of the ashes of the Peninsular War, a new order emerged, one where the ideas of independence and self-determination clashed with the imperial dreams of men like Napoleon. And in the annals of history, the Iberian Peninsula would forever be remembered as the place where the tide of an empire began to turn. In the spring of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the height of his power. He controlled much of Europe, from the Iberian Peninsula to the banks of the Danube, weaving together a vast empire through conquest and diplomacy. But his ambitions knew no bounds. His eye was fixed on one last defiant rival, an empire stretching across the east. Russia. It was a land of vast, untamed wilderness, ruled by Tsar Alexander I, a man growing increasingly resistant to Napoleon's grasp. To Napoleon, Russia's defiance represented not just a political inconvenience, but a map-sized challenge to his legitimacy as the master of Europe. And so, in June of 1812, with an army of unprecedented size, over 600,000 men, a multinational force from nearly every corner of his empire, Napoleon launched his invasion. He called it the Second Polish War. But history would remember it as one of the most calamitous endeavors in military history, the invasion of Russia. The Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River on June 24th. The mood among the forces was upbeat, almost celebratory. This was the greatest army Europe had ever seen, led by history's most brilliant tactician. What could possibly go wrong? Napoleon's strategy was simple in theory. Engage and destroy the Russian army quickly. He believed that Tsar Alexander would be forced to defend Moscow, the beating heart of Russia, and that a swift, decisive victory would compel the Tsar to sue for peace. But the Russians, guided by their seasoned generals Barclay de Tolly and later Kutuzov, had no intention of playing into Napoleon's hands. Instead, they deployed a tactic that would vanquish the army of any would-be conqueror: retreat. At every step, the Russians melted deeper into their own sprawling territory, denying the French the decisive battle Napoleon craved. And as they retreated, they scorched the earth behind them, destroying crops, burning villages, and leaving nothing for the French to forage. Napoleon's Grande Armée, accustomed to living off the land as it marched, began to face its first logistical nightmare: hunger. By early August, the Grande Armée reached Smolensk, a critical supply depot and a key defensive position for the Russians. Here, Napoleon hoped for the clash he had sought since crossing into Russian territory. But once again, the Russians simply withdrew after limited resistance, leaving the city in flames. The burnt ruins of Smolensk offered no shelter or supplies for the French. Desecrated earth, empty skies. It was an omen of what was to come. Still, Napoleon pushed onward, deeper into the Russian expanse. He was gambling everything: his men, his empire, his reputation, on taking Moscow. By now, though, even he began to see that the odds were shifting, the stakes ballooning. Marching ahead, he lost thousands with every step to exhaustion, disease, and desertion. Yet Napoleon, the eternal gambler, pressed forward. Then, finally, the opportunity Napoleon had longed for emerged. On September 7th, near the village of Borodino, the Russian army turned to face the invader. It was to be the largest and bloodiest single-day battle of the Napoleonic Wars. The conflict raged sun-up to sundown, a symphony of cannon fire, musket volleys, and bayonets clashing in brutal melee. The fields of Borodino were left littered with tens of thousands of dead and wounded men, nearly 75,000 casualties in a single day. For Napoleon, Borodino was a Pyrrhic victory. The Russians withdrew, leaving the path to Moscow wide open. But there was no decisive victory to boast of. His Grande Armée was bleeding out, its supplies running thin, morale plummeting with every passing day. 1 week later, Napoleon entered Moscow. But the city he had sacrificed so much to reach offered no answers, no peace, no spoils, no glory. Moscow was silent. Its streets were eerily empty, save for a few stragglers left behind. Not long after, fires erupted, turning the city into a blazing inferno. Some say the fires were set by Russian saboteurs. Others claim they were a desperate scorched earth act sanctioned by the city officials. Either way, Napoleon's prize was a hollow victory, and one that burned. Napoleon waited in Moscow for over a month, hoping for a message from Tsar Alexander and dreaming of peace talks. But the silence from the Russian leader was louder than any cannonade. Alexander refused to negotiate. He knew the Russian winter was coming, and it would do the work his armies could not. By mid-October, Napoleon made the fateful decision to retreat. The Grande Armée began its long, harrowing journey westward. They had stayed too long. The Russian winter arrived like an executioner, ready to fulfill its grim duty. The temperatures plunged far below freezing. Snow blanketed the land. The winds cut through the soldiers like icy blades. Starvation stalked the columns as they tried to head for safety, and behind them, Russian forces converged. It was not just the cold, or the hunger, or the exhaustion. The retreat turned into chaos as Russian Cossacks, light, swift cavalry, launched relentless raids on the limping army. In places like the Berezina River, French forces fought desperate battles just to avoid complete annihilation. For every step westward, the Grande Armée left behind bodies, thousands, tens of thousands, lost to the cold, the enemy, and despair. By the time Napoleon staggered back to safer territory, his once mighty Grande Armée, that undefeated force of 600,000 men, had been utterly shattered. Fewer than 100,000 made it out of the Russian campaign alive. The rest were gone, killed, captured, or vanished forever into the vast Russian plains. Yet the failure was not just military. Napoleon's halo of invincibility, his mythic reputation, had been destroyed. Rumors of the disaster emboldened his enemies across Europe, sparking fresh coalitions eager to bring him down. Within 2 years, Napoleon's empire would crumble completely. The campaign against Russia was not just a defeat. It was a cataclysm that reshaped Europe and history itself. For Napoleon, the invasion was the gamble of a lifetime, and it cost him everything. Thank you for watching Historical Moments. We hope you enjoyed this trip through history. If you liked the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories from the past. Until next time, keep exploring the moments that changed history.